Welcome to the Filmlinks podcast.
A bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 105, World War II Reflection.
It's the really depressing one.
It's not an easy one, and even though, you're not having to watch the films if you choose not to, there's probably just, strong general crimes against humanity warning at the beginning of this episode, because we're going to be talking about a lot of that today, because that's kind of how you have to end any discussion of World War II is the things that happened, behind the scenes, so to speak, not on the front lines, not even in front of the general civilian population, were so atrocious that it has to be the last thing on your mind when you leave any kind of discussion about World War II, because the exhortation is always, this can never happen again, which I think is how all three of these movies basically, is basically the point that they make in three very different ways. And we're going to talk about that. Two very unconventional ways, one that's a little more, standard as far as a filmmaking perspective, but all of it is, this should not have ever happened, but now that it has, we have to make sure it never, ever, ever happens again.
Yeah. It was a unique situation in World War II that was both caused by the deepest depravity limits of humanity and sparked the deepest depraved moments of humanity and what humanity is capable of. And it's important to discuss the effect of that, the lasting effect of that, because it's still very much in living memory, and, trying to preserve that memory to help ensure that it never happens again, which I think is the goal of all three films that we are going to talk about today, which will be Night and Fog from 1956 from director Alain Resnais. You'll notice there's two Frenchmen in this week's podcast and one Japanese man.
I don't think we covered any Resnais films.
We have not covered any Resnais films before on the podcast, although he is a very successful over outside of this movie. This is also only 30 minutes long, which
quotes on only.
Yeah, this is but it's also probably going to be the longest 30 minutes of your life, as it directly shows documentary footage from the liberation of the camps. Then there's going to be Shoah from 1985 from director Claude Lanzmann, which is, on the opposite side of things, is 9 hours long.
And uses no documentary footage.
Uses
archival footage, rather.
No archival footage. Technically, it's all documentary footage. It's just set in the 80s instead of the 40s. And it discusses... It's talking with those who are involved with the Holocaust in one way, shape, or form. Not just survivors, but people who worked in the camps, people who lived in towns that had camps in them, people who lived in communities with ghettos in them, all sorts of angles. And it manages to get very deep using a very limited set of film style techniques.
Yeah.
And then finally, there will be White Light and Black Rain from 2007 from director Steven Okazaki, which is obviously talking about the fallout of the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan at the end of World War II in the Pacific Theater. And it talks
mostly
about...
through interviews with
mostly
survivors.
through interviews, some archival footage of the wreckage, some archival pictures drawn by kids who were in the blast, all sorts of just very, very solid proof that a bomb like that should never be used ever.
Yeah.
Never again if possible. And it's a kind of destruction that makes you question whether or not it should have been used in the first place.
Right.
But before I do all the analyzing, before we get to the analyzing portion of the show, let's start with Night and Fog. Jason, take it away as best you can.
Night and Fog from 1956. Using documentary footage from the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps at the end of World War II, this short-form recounting of the horrors found within uses poetic editing to both soften and intensify the blow of coming face-to-face with one of the darkest sides of human capacity.
So I think when we're talking about documentaries, and we've done a little bit of documentary coverage on this podcast, it's probably one of the least covered segments of film that we've done so far, just in general. But when we did our dedicated documentary episode, we kind of talked a little bit about documentary voice. And I think that these are three really interesting examples of how the filmmaker uses voice to construct the film. And so in Night and Fog, it is a direct voiceover talking to the audience, bringing up hypothetical questions, pointing out things in the footage, kind of almost intentionally leaving some things unsaid in order to bring up questions. And so this is kind of the most direct that the filmmaker gets to having a conversation with the audience out of all three of these, I think.
Yeah, I think it has the most authorial intent and impression. I read a lot of reviews, and I tend to agree with those reviews when they say that this feels poetic in a way, in form. Right? There's a connection through music. There's a very solid connection of editing and cutting and flow. And it's hard to say that it's beautiful because of the things being depicted. But I feel like the way it's been cut together and the way it's been shown help amplify the deep sadness felt at seeing it, and also kind of help you process it in a way. Like, I feel like if you just watched the straight archival footage, if you just watched the straight documentary footage, I feel like it would be almost too much for anyone to really even start to digest in the moment while watching it. It's some deep, dark, terrible things that look like they shouldn't be real, but they are real. And the way it's cut and flow and kind of flowed and smoothed together, kind of it makes the pill easier to digest. Even though once it gets to your stomach, it's still some dark stuff that you're experiencing.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that makes this film different from Shoah, because Shoah is left all to our imagination, and Night and Fog kind of actually gives us that actual visual presentation of the things that happened, through footage by the Allied liberators, but also through Nazi footage, which it's still absolutely incredible that the Nazis actually recorded some of this stuff themselves. But the other thing that, like you were saying, the kind of chocolate coating, I guess, that it, in a terrible turn of phrase, that Renee puts on this is the cutting back and forth between current day and the archival footage. So he shows the camps as they are now. He shows them in the broad daylight, in color, and then that is just kind of like smash contrasted with the black and white archival, poorly lit, grimy footage of the stuff that was actually happening. And so that's part of the technique here, is to create that contrast and go back and forth so much that you realize that the line between there and here is not as far as you think it is. It's not, an impossibility. He wants us to associate our current situation with these things because, before it happened, we probably would have said it couldn't happen that way. It could never be done. And so we can't really ever say that it won't happen again because we know what people are capable of now. So keeping those two, the past and the present, in this really tenuous connection to each other is really important.
And it's certainly, I mean, one of the dark things kind of about what you just said, Jonathan, is that it's certainly not the most recent genocide to happen in the world.
Right.
But for so many people, I think, studying those genocides or trying to look beyond the numbers becomes so difficult. And so pieces like this become incredibly important in a way, because yes, you and I can go look up the archival footage from the liberation of the camps. Anybody could do that. But having a constructed piece put together makes it so much more readily available and makes it kind of a little more human again, when it otherwise would seem so distant on this silent archival footage. It makes it, I don't even want to say easier, but it makes it you more ready to look at the face of the Holocaust now. Like, seeing these human faces directly affected by, these terrors and horrors that happened, it's deep and affecting, and even more so in this format.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing that's kind of interesting is especially like thinking about these films, again, in the context of our series that we've been doing. We started off the series doing, essentially documentaries with propaganda films. And so it's interesting to think about these films in contrast with the documentaries that we covered. Because like Night and Fog actually has footage from Triumph of the Will in it, because it is giving kind of a broad overview. So, for example, whereas in Shoah, we're going to really, really focus down on the Jewish persecution, Night and Fog gives a little bit more of a broader, less specific kind of view and condemnation. So it's not specifically talking about the ways that the Jews were treated racially or the ways that the Germans acted. It's the Nazis and those that the Nazis killed and imprisoned and all that kind of stuff. And so kind of taking this really broad, here's what the Nazis did, here's how they kind of came into power, and here's how that power went to their head and what they did with that, almost gives us a little bit of a Capra-esque kind of a approach to it, just in a general form, because it is driven by that narration and it is making really strong and direct moral judgments. And so it's interesting to see how the tone changes from we have to fight this war because Germany's not going to stop. We don't really know what they're doing to the people that they've captured, but we know that they're capturing people and they're disappearing and they're going on an imperial rampage. And then to the way that we look back on it now and we're like, oh my gosh, this is 1,000 times worse than we could ever possibly have imagined. And then the tone drops from like a courageous, heroic, come on, we gotta stop this, to how could this have even happened? Like it's a unanswerable question, and it's so much bigger than anyone could have possibly imagined at the outset. That it's just crazy to put those two views of the war from before and during, and then immediately after to even present day. Those two approaches are so different, and it's kind of crazy because they're about the same thing. We generally knew that this was bad, but once you know exactly what happened and showing exactly what happened in this movie, it changes a lot in terms of perspective. So, Alex, real quick, what do you think about, since we have two extremes on this episode, what do you think about the length of the film and what is able to be conveyed in the 35 minutes that the film comprises?
I think this is the perfect length for this movie. I think any more and you're pushing it. Even 30 minutes kind of feels like it pushes it, and it's padded with a lot of train footage.
Is that because it is footage of the actual atrocities that there's only so much that you can expect an audience to take in at a time?
I think it's both for the audience's sake, and the filmmaker's sake as well. And then to a further extent, like I mentioned before, this is a very poetic film, and I feel like those typically always end up shorter. Even when they're at feature length, they typically end up on the shorter side of things. The films where you feel the story is more about how you're feeling than the events or the character arcs or changes that you're witnessing.
Yeah, I can see that. I don't think that's always the case, but it's definitely true, especially in narrative film. I guess it's a little bit harder to maintain, I guess, if you don't have the strongest of plot or like driving actions. But I think here it's that coupled with the fact that there's a lot of footage, but there's only so much of it that you can show before you've kind of like, we understand how bad it was. You know, there's diminishing returns at some point of how outraged, I guess, we can be. But it uses everything that it has really effectively and poignantly. And I think, again, just coming back to the fact that we are seeing these actual images in a way that we don't get if we're just hearing the stories, is like, so for example, probably the most striking image to me in the entire film is the shot of the hair that was shaved from the women prisoners before they were annihilated. And it's just like, it's a mountain and it looks endless. And there's a lot, it's not like a close up. There's a lot of hair in that shot. And then it shows the fabric that was made from the hair. But it's just one of those things where without seeing how much hair there is, you can't really imagine it, or at least it doesn't feel as real just hearing, like even me saying right now, there was a literal mountain of hair, like a warehouse entirely filled with hair. And until you actually like see that image, it's just a story. And so Rene puts those two elements together. He tells us a story in really pointed and direct terms through the voiceover, but then he also, knows when to show it and knows when to hold back a little bit and show the camps as they are today, and just kind of make that contrast.
All right, so let's move on to Shoah from 1985. Jason, take it away.
Shoah from 1985. 9 hours of those who survived and were involved with the Holocaust recounting their stories with the aid of the director's crew and an interpreter. Without using documentary footage, it focuses on the living memory of the events.
All right, so this is a film that is incredibly long. I think if it was made 10 to 15 years later, it would have been a series of documentaries.
Yeah. Although I kind of want to challenge that, because I think we brought that up beforehand, but I don't. It would have to change form a lot if you broke it up into 10 different parts.
Okay, so obviously this is very relevant as a documentation, but I think the form is going to be a big question for this, because as a 9 or 9.5 hour thing, as you point out, Jonathan, this is not consumable as a movie. You cannot watch this as a movie. You are going to watch this as a series. You have to take breaks.
You can watch it in parts, but I think that what would have to happen if it were to be released in parts, even all at once, like we do now with Netflix series, is you have to give each part a different structure than if you're just creating one sequence of events. And this does have technically two parts. There is a break, and it says the second era. And so there's at least two parts. So it's at least a little bit more consumable as 2 4-hour parts, 4.25-hour parts, however it's broken up, somewhat. And I know it's coming from the guy who's watched 12 hours of Lord of the Rings on a practically annual basis. But I think that there is a flow and an intentionality to the storytelling that would be very much altered if you change the way that it's released and had to chop it up and make it into 10 different individually cohesive segments.
Yeah. And to that extent, I'd actually say the form here feels lacking to me because it's not made in a way that can easily be consumed. If it's meant to be watched in 2 4.5-hour parts, that's almost condemning it to being watched by a very small portion of the potential audience by not making it more readily consumable, digestible, reachable. It is...
That may be the case anyway, because I think that this film serves a very specific purpose, and Landsman knows it, and Landsman's interviewers know, or interviewees know it, because they often reference, and he leaves in there the fact that, for example, the Polish official who didn't know what was going on until he was actually taken on a tour of the ghetto, and he says, I don't go back there in my mind, but I understand why you are making this film, and so I'm going to do it for you. And there are moments where the concentration camp survivors will be breaking down, and he forces them to go on in a gentle but stern way. And he says, you have to. We have to do this. You know that. Because as we've been talking about for the past 4 or 5 episodes, this is a film that can only be made at a certain time. This film, as it is, cannot be made today. It had to have been made when it was made. And so the more complete that it is, the better it is as a document, which is essentially what documentaries are.
Yeah, this is
history.
I 100% agree with that. I think this is more of a document than it is a documentary, even though it's technically both.
Okay, so in terms of like style, why is this, just because of the length, why is this kind of taken out of the realm of documentary as opposed to things like, Grey Gardens, which is just a kind of random record of things of these ladies in their house, or other things that we've seen that push the kind of documentary boundary. And this one has a lot of documentary technique in it. It's just really extended.
In Grey Gardens, you still have an arc of a portrait being constructed of these ladies. And as much as the documentarians, which I believe were brothers in that case, were trying to just be flies on the wall, their take was very present in the way they cut and edited it together. I think there's something belying in the word documentary, because it sounds unpresented when it is. And I think this has, obviously there is some impact from Landsman in the way this is constructed and received, but it's minimalized to a large extent. a
I'm gonna fight you
of,
on this, Alex.
a lot of these scenes are almost just presented, like just rolled on, for a long time. Occasionally there's some cutting together. Occasionally there's like a moment or two where there's some there's kind of like this meta film documentary style added in, some cutting in of B-roll, or this or that. Or I really like whenever we actually get to like the van where they're cutting everything together.
Oh, that's not what I thought the van was.
What's the van?
I think the van is surveillance. I don't, because that was only for actual Nazi officers, and I don't think the Nazis knew that they were being video and audio recorded. I think they thought that Lanzmann was just taking notes on them, and that video footage was an undercover camera, and the audio was like being picked up, and it was all being transferred back to the van because they weren't allowed to have an actual like video crew in those rooms. That's the way I saw it.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. But yeah, obviously collecting. I feel like the artistry here comes from a larger perspective than we typically see with documentaries. It's like a collection of sorts. It's like he's an expert archivist
he's almost
in putting this together.
A champion too. Like it really feels like he has this sense of purpose in creating this film and championing the Jewish people who can no longer champion themselves, and those who have made every effort to just live a normal life and don't have an urge to speak out or get their story told in any kind of, big, large action like this. And so Lanzmann has, for whatever reason, I haven't done too much read up on why Lanzmann felt pulled. I mean, he is of Jewish descent. He fought in the French Resistance during the war, but he definitely feels that he has to make this film to capture the atrocities, the experience of the people who were there, the experience of the people who turned a blind eye, which is one of the most interesting parts of the film, the people who committed these atrocities. Again, he interviews the Nazis, he interviews even down to the people driving the trains into the concentration camps. And
that was a really fascinating segment. That was
the people who run the trains, the train stations, and all that stuff.
I think my thing here is that I think documentary is the closest film genre we currently have to describe what this is, but I don't know if it's entirely accurate, or if it is a documentary.
Okay,
it
so
is
how's
like
it
a
different from
subgenre. This feels like an archival.
They shall not grow old. That is even more archival than this film.
It is, but They Shall Not Grow Old is cut together through a string of it's a series of archival footage cut together with some talking heads thrown in, but there are still a series of stylistic choices made in the way that's strung together into scenes, into sequences. This kind of feels almost in a weird way kind of like more like a book to me. Like I almost feel like this is like a historical like record made by a scholar. Like I feel like the work he's doing here is like the work of a scholar.
Yes.
Which is almost kind of like an insult to film in a way that I'm saying that. But like the short format that film is typically in, which is done typically to coincide with the length of time you can capture one person's attention with them in one spot not moving, is kind of out the window when you're trying to do what he's doing. And I feel like the work he's doing here is obviously incredibly important because I know why he doesn't blink too often when people are actually like telling their stories. He wants every single second of it on film, because
he also wants their faces and their emotions that they are not speaking to come across.
For
example, the interview with the barber is the
I was about to say
example.
literally that. Like there's like a 2-minute segment where he doesn't say anything, but also it's just because he's just feeling, and you can see the emotions playing across his face. Also, just real quick on the barber scene, Jonathan, I found it really interesting because halfway through, I also noticed, I was wondering what the guy getting his haircut by the barber recounting the Holocaust, was that like a friend who agreed to get his haircut? Or is it just some random dude who went into the barber shop today and, oh my gosh, suddenly my barber's talking about the Holocaust for 30 minutes?
Yeah, I want to get into kind of Landsman's role, like the way that he gets into the lives of the people that he's interviewing here in a second. But I do want to first just kind of rephrase what I think you're kind of getting at, because I did have a similar sense. I wasn't thinking of it in those terms, but I did have a sense that this is an anthropological or sociological exploration more than anything else. Like on a really
way more, that's way more accurate. Like an exploration of sorts, a record of sorts. Because it is, and it's wrong to say that it's not like a story either. Because they're all stories being told, and they're very important in the way they're being told.
And they are put in the chronology roughly of the timeline of the war.
Yeah. But the way the overall piece is constructed is just so distant from what we're used to. It's Landsman's really using the skills and technique and medium of film and movies to do something that I think is decidedly greater than that, and more important than that, and more extensive than that.
I can agree with you on that.
That is denser than that, because it's not an easy watch. One, obviously, it's more Holocaust content, more Holocaust stories, firsthand accounts. You're flip flopping between feeling very sympathetic to people to just being galled by how callous others were, or how little they seem to have thought of it, and until this guy comes along asking questions. So not only are you going between like emotional extremes, but it's long. There are some English segments. There's a good chunk of the film in English. But the odds are you're going to be reading most of it in like French or subtitles translated from French or German or Polish. It was sometimes,
regardless of what your language is, there's no one language that dominates the film.
This is very, very cosmopolitan, in a tragic way. But like, I mean, there's some interviews where it's as an English viewer, you are reading the subtitles that the translator is saying from the person's story who's speaking in like, Yiddish or Polish or whatever, another variety of languages, which is it's interesting because there's a lot of times you're digging through like 3 or 4 layers of like interposition and translation between you and the person telling the story, and they're traveling across 40 years of time to tell you the story as well. The story as it is frozen in 1985, or probably the early 1980s or late 70s is when he started collecting these. So it is a difficult thing to get into, and not for the faint of heart. You kind of have to have like a scholar's mindset to be willing to dive into this.
I agree.
This is not an entertainment piece in the slightest. This is the farthest we're ever going to get from entertainment pieces. In all of filmings.
So I will say, again, just to keep building on this, I recently read in audio form the biography of Franz Jägerstätter, because we recently covered A Hidden Life on our bonus podcast, and so that's the biography that covers his life as a conscientious objector to the Nazi draft after Austria was annexed. And that book is written from the point of view of a sociologist. So he is both giving this guy's life, but he's also he goes to the guy's hometown. He talks to the people. He asks them questions, and he's asking, do you still think that he did the right thing by not fighting for the Nazis now that you know what the Nazis were doing? And they're so reticent to say that he did the right thing because they were so for him. Everyone was like, just go along with it. Just go along with the Nazis for now. We'll figure it out later, all that kind of thing. And it's something that it's hard to understand coming from our perspective, knowing how terrible the Nazis were, especially from a non-European perspective, because we don't have any of the cultural influences that were going on at the time. And we don't see what kind of arguments were being presented. And so when Landsman is interviewing the townspeople around the concentration camps, it's so interesting just to hear them, because they have almost no qualms. They say, oh yeah, we're sorry they're gone. But, for the most part, it's not like I would expect, where a documentary filmmaker comes in, they know that they were, to use quote unquote modern parlance, on the wrong side of history by turning a blind eye, and they're still just like, yeah, well, we couldn't do anything. There's oh yeah, the Jews, they were all taken away. They all died. That was a shame, huh? But they have no sense of responsibility or shame or anything like that. And it's just so interesting to see that perspective in person from their own mouths. And there's I want to say the only non-victim who has probably what you would expect the most human response to be is the Polish official who is talking about his experience going through the ghetto, and he loses it. And the people who were right there, who literally are talking about, oh yeah, we heard the Jews, they were screaming night and day. It was really annoying. And you're just like, that's all you have to say about this? And so that's what we mean when we say that this is a sociological exploration, because he is capturing his technique is so good. He's almost like a lawyer in the way that he will go in and he will get people to be comfortable with him, first of all, and then open up about these things. And then also he really slyly, and I think geniusly, exposes people's inconsistencies and stuff like that, or if not to the individuals themselves, then for the audience. So, for example, there's a moment where he's talking to these two people in I can't remember which town, but it was right outside one of the concentration camps, and they're in this really nice house, and he's like, "Hey, this is a beautiful house. It's got all these decorations on the front. Do you know what these mean?" And they're like, "No, I don't really know." They're like, who used to? How long has this been here? Who used to live here? And they're like, "Okay, all the Jews used to live in the center of town right here, and then all the Polish people lived over there by the latrines or whatever." And he's like, "So how long have you guys lived here?" Like, "Oh, I guess about the wartime." And he's like, "Where did you used to live?" "Oh, we used to live over there by the latrines." "So you've gotten rich, huh?" And they're like, "Yeah, I guess so." And he's building an argument through his questions that the people don't really see coming, but it builds in the viewer's mind this really complete picture without feeling like he's interrogating them. And I think he does that throughout the entire film, and it's really, really genius.
Yeah, no, it's pretty subtle. It's pretty, I don't want to say sly, because that feels like the intent is ill,
ingenuous.
It's pretty, it's very good at, one, getting them to open up, but two, no matter what he does, he tends to find a way to let people tell their stories in their own words.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is important. And I feel like
even when he turns it on them.
Yeah, even though he turns it on them, it is still their story, it is still their words. And I feel like he tries to, even when he's at his most involved, like directly asking the questions in scenes, I feel like he tries to keep he himself out of the narrative when it's not when it's about somebody else's experience, especially when that experience is particularly harrowing.
For a while, I didn't know if he was going to be on camera at all, but he does let himself go in and out of the film. There's one moment where he reads
over the course
to the
of a
camera.
9-hour film. It's hard to not.
Especially such a the way that he does it. So again, just speaking of voice, Night and Fog is voiceover. So Alan Renee has written it. He has someone else read it, but it's the filmmaker talking to us directly. Shoah is Lanzmann interviewing the subjects on camera. So it's the filmmaker talking to the subject for the audience rather than talking to the audience directly. I'm just so fascinated with the different ways that voice can be done in films. So he does have this. He varies his interview technique depending on who he's talking to. He is much more direct and I don't want to say condescending, but definitely he does not put up with the Nazis' excuses, and he will fight them on it, and they just keep backpedaling. They will backpedal themselves into a corner. And so he's really direct with them, calling them out, and then he's really, like I said, kind of almost more gently leading some of the other townspeople into revealing their inconsistencies, and then with the actual Holocaust survivors, and depending, because they all have different personalities, but he can be gentle with them. But then, like I said, if he really needs something, because he has such a sense of purpose, this is not a film that it's like, okay, if you're uncomfortable, we don't have to do this. That's okay. Lanzmann knows if he does not capture this now, this may be the last chance to capture it. So he is very adamant about doing that.
Yeah, the timing of this film is pretty important. Like,
yeah. I think it's interesting that we are practically the same amount of time away from this film that this film is from the actual Holocaust.
Oh, yeah. This is 1985. It is getting to that point where the folks who survived the Holocaust are getting into their 60s, their 70s, their 80s. The ones who are old enough to really be cognizant of the things that were going on are even older. And you're right. This is kind of the last chance to get it all on film in all detail possible.
So I will say about the style, did you get Tarkovsky vibes? I don't want to overuse that term, but this vibes. Definitely
it makes sense.
It's very floaty. A lot of the footage going, because he'll go through the concentration camps. I think he went through all the ones that are mentioned practically as they stand today, which is in many cases a heap of rubbles. In the case of which one? I can't remember which one it is. One of the main Chemno.
Yeah, there's some flim on that.
It's a monument. And that monument, I think, is actually really interesting with the stones that they're really jagged and pointed, and they're all, obviously thousands of them in this memorial that has been built across the entire site of the concentration camp, with a giant slab in the middle where the crematorium was. And I have to imagine that monument of all of those stones with the names on them is Spielberg's inspiration for the tiny rocks on Schindler's grave at the end of Schindler's List, because the final effect ends up being very similar, except for the one in Schindler's List is like a little teeny tiny baby version of this huge, amazing Holocaust memorial at this site.
Yeah, no, it is. And that's another part of, or one of the benefits of this being so long and expansive, is that you get to see just how expansive the reach of this event is across how many different communities, how many different borders, languages. This experience was. You get to see how institutionalized it was. I mean, think of how many concentration camps we see in this movie, and they're all huge.
Treblinka, Chemno, Auschwitz. I don't think he goes to Dachau, but I mean, he shows
It's definitely
probably
mentioned.
5 or 6. So he doesn't go. It's not like he goes to every single concentration camp in that kind of a way, but it is still a really extensive picture.
Yeah, and that I mean, that's one of the scariest parts. That I think it even takes a minute to sink in after you've sat through the film. Is just how big it is. It's ridiculous in a very, very sad way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of these things that, as much as we talk about it, we can't really do it full justice. It's one of those that, and we've said this before, but this may be one of the purest examples of you just have to watch it kind of a thing, but you have to know what you're getting into at the same time.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. So obviously we did not hit everything that goes on in that movie, but we do need to move on now to White Light, Black Rain. So Jason set that one up for us.
White Light, Black Rain from 2007. Only 2 nuclear bombs have ever been used on humans, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And while the fear of the atomic bomb has spread throughout the world since the Cold War, only the survivors of these bombings can convey their experiences of true terror and horror at one of, if not the worst weapon humans have ever used on each other.
All right, I don't think there's any debate that this is a formal documentary, Alex.
No, this one is the most formal of the 3 documentaries.
Yeah.
It combines...
Pretty traditional.
Yeah. Interviews, documentary footage, all
Images.
Sorts of relatively familiar techniques to those who are familiar with documentaries or just film in general. And what's more, it's on the shorter side as well because it is a made for TV documentary. Unless you are one of the people who prescribes to it's not TV, it's HBO. In which case, it's a made for HBO documentary. But it is heavy. It is talking directly to victims of the bombings who somehow survived. A lot of them just
stories.
survived through like dumb luck, and you kind of get the sense that maybe they almost wish they hadn't.
Yeah, several of them are, well, some of them actually say that directly, but some of them, I think there was more than one that said that the bomb went off and their entire family died except for them. And like what, they don't explain, like, I don't know, was there an extra wall in wherever part of the house they were in or what? Like,
I don't think a lot of them know. Yeah. Thankfully, somehow we got through the entire Cold War without another bomb being dropped on humanity yet so far. And so we only have these 2 cases at which to look, and we don't know a lot about how some people might survive a bombing. It is...
We know a lot about what happens to people if they do survive it.
If they do survive. A lot of the people who survived... A lot of the people who did survive did not survive for long. Intense burns. They go into graphic detail. And the scars they show you on some of the people who survived are just twisted and horrific.
This is another one that there's a sense of timing and there's a sense of there's a necessity to it. So, for example, the guy who does actually take his shirt off and show you his body and how devastated he's been, that he says, I would not have done this, but I need to show the world that this can't happen again. And I mean, again, it's graphic. He has skin literally clinging to his ribs and his back is entirely scarred. And it's also even more shocking because some of these, and especially going into the film, knowing what it's about and who these interviewees are, you're almost looking for, like, in a strange way, you're almost looking for the deformities right off of the bat. And some of them is very obvious, but it's not. His face looks practically normal. And then he takes his shirt off, and then you can only imagine what those who you can see the scarring on their faces, what the rest of them looks like that you can't even see, and what they have to live with every single day.
Yeah. It's a devastating look at what can happen. I appreciate the way they use art, like 2-dimensional art, over the course of this movie.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
There is a really interesting scene towards the end where one of the people connected to the bombings is essentially live painting a portrait depicting the bombing. And it's not just the final picture, but it's how he draws the picture.
Art. Yeah,
it's really interesting. But there's also set a ton of pictures, essentially by kids, who are either depicting the bombing or survived the bombing and are describing it the best way they can through images.
And there's even the one guy who was a graphic artist.
Yeah, there's the one guy who went on to make a manga based off of his experience. Off of his experience. Of course, turned into a much happier story. But I also find it interesting the moral angle and choices made in this movie. And of course, you have to keep in mind that it's made for an American network. Stephen Okazaki is a Japanese-American filmmaker. He's kind of in a good position to make this. Obviously, it's America who dropped the bombs, partially because they didn't know what would happen, partially because the war didn't. There's a lot to get into why the bombs were dropped. But early on in this film, they kind of get into this idea that we're not going to talk about whether or not it was right to drop the bombs in that one instance. They're going to talk about why this bomb should never be used on humans.
That's a good point. I didn't even think about that, but you're right. They don't build a case one way or another, like kind of condemning America for using the bomb in order to bring about the desired end, which was ultimately achieved. So, obviously they're like, it's kind of implied that if there was any other way for this to have achieved that goal, that would have been the better route, because literally anything would have been better than this. But now that it's happened, it can't happen again. But so the interviews that aren't survivors, though, are there are a couple of interviews with pilots of the aircraft that dropped the bombs, and those are really fascinating too, in the sense of those interviews are very much like the civilians in Shoah. Some of them don't seem to have that much, I don't want to say of a conscience, but they seem very matter of fact and almost cavalier in a couple cases. There are some instances where they're having kind of internal struggle and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But probably the most affected we see in American in relation to all this is in the footage of This Is Your Life. What is it? This Is Your Life?
Yeah. It's like This Is Your Life, which seems a little bit of like a sick American twist on it to exploit something like that for a reality TV show. Except that the reactions from both people, both the survivor of the bombing and the pilot who dropped the bomb, are so genuine and relevant to the moral question being posed in this movie.
Yeah. So for context, This Is Your Life was a TV show on at the time in the 40s or 50s, I guess, and they decided that in a gesture of reconciliation, they would have one of the survivors of the atomic bomb shake hands with one of the pilots who dropped the bomb, and the expression on the pilot's face is one of like pure shame, and he's keeping himself very composed because he's on national television, but you can see him struggling through this interaction. And it's really genuine, and it's really even one of the Japanese women who's interviewed. Actually, I think her interview was pulled from a different documentary because it didn't look the same as some of the interviews that were shot for this film. She was like, I remember being there on that show, and his reaction was so genuine that I really felt for him. So that is really fascinating. But really, the interviews with the survivors are the main focus of the film, and the way that the filmmaker gets across the experience of being there, which is amazing that we have any record of that, and also not only the experience of living through the bomb, but living after the bomb, because this is not a one-time event when we're talking about survivors of an atomic explosion. This is something that is irrevocably part of them physically and emotionally. And that is made very, very clear and really delved into in this film.
Yeah. They're all irrevocably linked to that event. And you can tell a lot of them are using it as a way to, even though it's not necessarily something they relish in or enjoy or even ever want to do, in showing their injuries or talking about their experiences because of clearly how traumatizing and painful it is, they're doing it out of the sense of obligation to ensure that future generations don't repeat the mistake that happened in theirs. Now, the stories here aren't as extensive or detailed as in Shoah, but part of Shoah's appeal was about their direct recollection as it stood in 1985, whereas I feel like White Light, Black Rain is trying to is focused more on 1945 than on 2007.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, and it's very much, this is how it happened. This is my memory, as clear as I can make it out. And this is why it shouldn't happen again. That's kind of as direct into the future that it goes. It's not so much a commentary on the current world situation or anything like that. It is
it doesn't
just, this can't happen again.
Yeah, and it doesn't really make any moral condemnations against
of like America specifically.
Against America, or even against like the pilots who dropped the bomb. It's almost like they're talking about how they knew it would do damage, but they didn't know how bad or how completely different this horrifying act was than something they had done before. And you can kind of see the realization come across, because, you can hear about the bombs, and you can hear about, how bad they were, how many people they killed. And then you see the footage and you listen to the people who actually survived, get their perspectives on it, and put faces, put injuries, see those children's pictures, and it becomes a very different event in your mind.
Yeah, which is what makes documentaries like these different from a textbook or even like a scholarly article or even audio. Having their faces and seeing the emotions that they go through and the changes in their face as they tell the story is so important. And it's one of the things that nothing else can capture the way that film does, which is really, and one of the things that we were talking about kind of off air, Alex, is the fact that this film is sort of the only, I don't want to say it's not well reviewed or anything. It is, but it's not like Shoah, where Shoah is basically seen as one of the towering documentaries of all time. And even Night and Fog is pretty well known as far as World War II documentaries, because Alan Rene is a very accomplished director in his own right. And so, but White Light, Black Rain it's more modern, and I feel like it has less of a place in the public consciousness, which is fascinating because of how ingrained the atomic bomb is into almost all of our stories these days, like science fiction stories. And we've covered Godzilla, we've covered even the classic Planet of the Apes has atomic stuff. My favorites, like Twilight Zone, has atomic fallout just riddled all throughout it, and yet there's not really a good defining like documentary about the atomic bombs. This is probably the closest that we'll get, and yet it doesn't hold this very esteemed place in film criticism, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, it's almost a shame that there isn't more on this topic. Part of it might be that it's a little touchy for Americans, but even that I don't entirely buy.
But it's also, needing it. It almost needs a Stephen Okazaki. It needs someone on the Japanese side to tell that story. And I don't know what the kind of prevailing attitude about it is. Maybe it's a sweep it under the rug thing, and there are a very limited amount of people with the resources and willingness to create this type of film.
Don't they open this documentary with that? With asking like a series of questions on the street, like what happened in 1945?
That's right, and they don't know.
And most people don't know, and that's why it's one of the reasons why film is so important.
Which is, I was thinking like, maybe not everyone, but I feel like a lot of Americans are familiar with the fact that, even like December 7th,
I feel like,
Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, we're very familiar with that. We're very familiar with the atomic bomb.
Maybe not the exact day, but 1945, like anything relating to 1945 always immediately gets put in World War II is just ending kind of context. And I feel like in Japan, you would probably know that, but it's fascinating. And it may be cherry-picked interviews or whatever, but...
Heck, I remember when we studied ethics and morality in high school, that being a very common question asked, was dropping the atomic bomb the right thing to do in that situation? And I remember that being very pervasive, at least in our school. Maybe not in the entirety of America. The quality of education can be a bit spotty here. But, it's interesting that so many people wouldn't have an immediate reaction to it. And it kind of shows you why.
Here's the other thing is 9/11. Like literally we name the event after the date so that it's not forgotten. So I don't know. It's just, it is really fascinating that that's how they open the film. I'd almost forgotten about that.
It's a fascinating piece of film that I wish there were more like, and it's nice that at least this one existed and took the time to document all these people's stories.
And it is very competent. If it's not, the most poetic film that we've watched today or anything, it is handled very sensitively, very thoroughly.
It's really solid. It still is a TV documentary, it's not TV, it's HBO documentary, but it does it within its format of a TV documentary. It does a fabulous job of covering the topic with a lot of sensitivity and nuance and detail, both sympathetically and without recrimination. So Jonathan, do you want to slide into overall notes and talk about why it's so important that these movies exist?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course we have been covering that. But these films need to exist because even today, as we're speaking, none of these films can be made again. They are so time sensitive. And there's like this period of time where, for example, Shoah, there's a period of time where your subjects are so connected as far as being literally inside of the concentration camps that there's a time you have to give for grieving. And although that can never be completed for those people, there's also a point where it has to be documented or else it will never be documented. And you can feel that urgency that Landsman has saying, we have to get this because we will never be able to again. And so there, even like Night and Fog, which is exclusively either footage of the camps as they are now, which we could still shoot again. They're fairly well preserved as monuments and documents. But and of course the archival footage, which we could still pull from and cut together. And yet Alan Rene has a perspective of being in Europe at the time of the war. It is made, practically just over 10 years after the war. And his sense of moral outrage will always be more intense than ours. As much as we can intellectually have that moral outrage, we can never physically and emotionally have the level of outrage that Alan Rene or any of the filmmakers from that time period have. In Claude Lanzmann being of Jewish descent and being part of the French Resistance, and even Stephen Okazaki being of the Japanese people and being, I'm sure, growing up with stories of the atomic bomb and stuff like that. These are films that have to be made from a certain perspective at a certain time. And if not, then we won't have these documents. And again, the fact that we have faces on camera showing is a documentation of as much a mindset as a set of historical facts and events. And that mindset comes through our interpretation of the faces telling the story, which is so important in all three of these films. And any event along these lines, or any kind of tragedy, whether it be, even a natural disaster, I think these films are a good lesson that these films need to be made again. They have to keep being made until there's no need for them anymore, which is the ultimate goal, obviously.
Yeah. It's part of the reason that they're made. Human memory is shamefully and notoriously short. Part of the reason for that is just new humans being born and old humans dying all the time. So the people who've learned the lessons, like the people who are being vitally interviewed in these films, are disappearing. And the newer people don't have, all they have is half the time are facts or numbers on a page. And they don't have that internalized gut reaction to, stuff like genocide.
Right.
I shouldn't laugh when I say genocide, but it's a coping mechanism. I apologize. And they need to get to that somehow. And you get to that by putting a face on it and, making it personal. And this is one of the ways to do that.
Yeah. And again, I think that the range of perspective is also an important part of this picture, because I don't think that it would do to have a World War II documentary or a Holocaust documentary. The fact that we have Night and Fog, which is the filmmaker talking to us and almost guiding us through what we should be feeling and what we should be thinking, to Shoah, which is the storyteller talking to these people for us and showing us that interaction and letting us be in there in those conversations, to White Light, Black Rain, which is just a direct conversation between the subject and the audience, without a direct influence of the storyteller. Obviously, he's guiding us through it almost invisibly through the editing and that kind of thing, but it's not like Lanzmann where we're seeing him talk to these people. We're seeing that interaction and the way that he's crafting those interactions. It's more of a direct interaction between us and seeing the interviewees. So having all those different types of perspectives, the difference between, Holocaust documentaries and focusing on the atomic bombings, all of those things, that range of perspective is just as important as these being documented at all, because an incomplete picture is not good enough, I feel like.
Yeah, no. And we'll never have a complete enough picture.
Right, obviously.
So having that variety in there is very, very, very vital. Do you think there's something about this topic, Jonathan, that lends itself to this particular style of documentary?
I think we've had a range of styles. So
we do have a range of styles, but I would say one in which the the stylization of the film is less important than the content of the film, if that makes sense.
I think so. I think that kind of comes with the territory of building gravitas, which is a necessary element of all of these. And I think it's the tone that you have to get to is almost this sense of, I don't want to say to some extent it doesn't matter how it's presented as long as it is presented, but you're right. The fact that it is presented is so important that, again, we can argue over whether or not Shoah is a documentary because it doesn't matter. All that matters is that Shoah exists, in one way or another. And so I think that they're very specific stylistic choices on all three of these films, but just, you're right, the content is the most important part as much as we can break down, the artistic merit of one or the other to whatever degree.
All right. With that, Jonathan, let's completely change tone and theme and wrap up the World War II series. And talk about what we're going to talk about next time on the show, which is very different. You guys voted on which dynamic Hollywood duo you would like us to talk about on the show, and you picked...
Our Patreon specifically.
Yes. If you would like to vote in future polls, feel free to subscribe. Jonathan will give you the details shortly. And you picked Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks, specifically their rom-com run of the 90s. And we're going to talk about Joe Versus the Volcano from 1990, Sleepless in Seattle from 1993, and You've Got Mail from 1998, which will be very different than what we talked about.
Quirky and fun.
Basically goes without saying, but it'll be a welcome change of pace, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And so if you would like to vote in future polls, you can do that by heading over to our Patreon account. Everyone who's involved in our Patreon is eligible to vote in polls. And if you would like to chip in a couple extra bucks and get the bonus podcast, you can hear our latest episode, which was about Guest of Honor, which is a short film available online, so you can watch it. But if you would like to hear our thoughts about it, then head over to Patreon. We'd appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And I'm at the Blue Jay, 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. Okay, this is White Light, Black Rain, take 2. Which is another one of those things that I agree makes it... okay. Okay, this is White Light, Black Rain, take 3.
And I'm actually recording this time.
Oh my gosh. So, for those of you counting at home, that's 3 times that we started White Light, Black Rain. And we finally finished it.